My name is Jonathan, and this story happened to me last summer. I decided to spend my vacation in a small seaside town in the USA called Oceanview. It was supposed to be the perfect place for a vacation: warm sun, white sand, and blue sea. I booked a small cottage located right on the beach. Upon arriving in the town, I immediately felt a strange chill. Despite the friendly smiles of the locals, something in the air felt off. I decided to ignore it and start my vacation. The first day went great. I swam in the ocean, enjoyed fresh seafood, and strolled along the shore. In the evening, I went to a local bar where I met some locals. They told me about the town, its history, and its legends. One of the stories caught my attention: the legend of the missing tourists. It turned out that a few years ago, several people had disappeared in this town, and no one knew what happened to them. The next day, I decided to explore the surroundings. I ventured into the island's interior and found an old abandoned amusement park. The place looked eerie: rusty rides, empty kiosks, and overgrown paths. I decided to head back, but noticed that the sun was already setting. I hurried to my cottage, feeling the darkness enveloping the town with every step. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt a strange unease that wouldn't let me rest. Suddenly, I heard a quiet whisper outside the window. Approaching it, I saw a dark figure standing in the shadows. It disappeared as soon as I opened the window. It was odd, but I decided it was just my imagination. On the third day, I decided to go fishing. I bought all the necessary gear and headed out to the open sea on a boat. After a while, I noticed a strange fish with black eyes that kept swimming around my boat. I caught it and returned to shore, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me. The fish seemed unnatural, as if it was watching me. Returning to the cottage, I saw that the door was open. I distinctly remembered closing it before leaving. Entering inside, I saw that everything was in place, but there was an old photograph on the table. It was a photo of my family taken many years ago. I couldn't understand how it got there. That evening, I went to a local cafe where I met a woman named Emily. She was very friendly and invited me to dinner at her house. During dinner, she told me about her husband, who had disappeared a few years ago. She said he was one of the tourists who vanished without a trace. Her story made me think about the strange events that had happened to me in recent days. After dinner, I decided to return to the amusement park. This time, I took a flashlight and a knife with me. When I arrived, it was completely dark. I began exploring the park and suddenly heard children's laughter. It was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It came from deep within the park, and I decided to find its source. Walking along the abandoned paths, I saw an old haunted house. It seemed the laughter was coming from there. I entered and immediately felt cold. Inside, it was dark, and I could barely see anything ahead. Suddenly, the flashlight went out, and I was left in complete darkness. I started moving by touch, and suddenly felt something cold touch my hand. I jerked my hand back and heard something rustling in the dark. My panic grew, and I decided to get out of this place as quickly as possible. But when I reached the exit, the door was closed. I started screaming and pounding on the door, but no one responded. At that moment, I realized I was trapped. Suddenly, I heard the same children's laughter behind me. Turning around, I saw a dark figure approaching me. It was a boy, but his eyes were completely black. He approached me and quietly said, "You are now one of us." I felt a cold and fear envelop me. My consciousness began to fade, and I fell to the floor. When I came to, it was already morning. I was on the beach, but I didn't remember anything that had happened that night. The locals found me and helped me return to the cottage. They said they saw me walking to the amusement park, but no one saw me return. I decided to leave this town immediately. Gathering my things, I drove back home, but the memories of those events still haunt me. I still feel that cold and hear children's laughter in my dreams. It was the most terrifying vacation of my life, and I will never return to Oceanview. Now I understand why people disappear there. This place is cursed, and its secrets are better left unsolved. My name is Alex, and this summer, I decided to work as a camp counselor at Golden Breeze Summer Camp. The camp is located deep in the forests of Oregon, far from the hustle and bustle of the city and technology. It was supposed to be the perfect place to relax and enjoy nature. But everything went wrong. I arrived at the camp early to prepare for the children's arrival. From the very first day, I felt that something was off. The forest was too quiet and the atmosphere was heavy and oppressive. But I chalked it up to my imagination and fatigue from the journey. On the first evening, I met the other counselors. We were all different, but we shared a common goal: to make the summer unforgettable for the kids. We sat around the campfire, talking and laughing, until we heard the first strange sounds from the forest. It was a strange noise, like the cry of a child. Everyone fell silent and looked towards the dark forest. But then we decided it was probably just an animal and continued our evening. The next day, the children arrived. They were excited and joyful, running around, playing and making new friends. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I shared my thoughts with another counselor, Sarah, but she just laughed and said it was typical camp jitters. The days passed quickly, and everything seemed normal. But at night, the real nightmare began. The cry in the forest grew louder and clearer. One time I decided to check it out. I took a flashlight and ventured deep into the woods. The further I went, the more I felt that someone was watching me. Suddenly, I saw something that made my heart stop. An old sign with the name of another camp. Night Breeze Camp, hung on a tree. It looked like this camp had been abandoned for a long time. Upon returning to our camp, I told the director about my find. He looked concerned and said that camp had closed many years ago due to a terrible tragedy. Children had disappeared without a trace, and the camp was never reopened. This explained why the Golden Breeze Camp was so close to another, yet no one knew about it. That night I couldn't sleep. The cry of a child became louder, and now other sounds joined in. Whispers, screams, and even laughter. I decided to go into the forest again, but this time not alone. Sarah agreed to go with me. We took flashlights and ventured into the darkness. The further we went, the more we felt we were not alone. It seemed like the forest was coming to life around us. We reached the abandoned camp, and that's when the real nightmare began. The cry of the child became so loud we couldn't hear our own thoughts. Suddenly, a figure of a girl emerged from the darkness. She was pale, her eyes glowing red, and blood dripped from her mouth. "Help me," she whispered. Sarah stepped back in fear, but I couldn't take my eyes off this horrifying sight. The girl reached out and touched me. I felt an icy chill envelop my body. I was paralyzed. "They're all here," she said. "They won't let you go." Suddenly we heard whispers around us. Dark figures began to appear from all sides. They were children, but they looked dead, their faces distorted with horror. Sarah screamed and ran back to the camp. I also ran after her, but I felt something pulling me back. The forest seemed to be trying to hold us. We barely escaped and reached the camp. The director met us at the door. He looked terrified and said we needed to leave the camp immediately. All the children and counselors were evacuated that very night. We returned to the city, but the horrors of that camp stayed with me forever. A few days later, I learned that Golden Breeze Camp had been closed again. It turned out that a few years ago, children also disappeared there, and the place was deemed unsafe. But for some reason, it was reopened, and no one knew about these terrible events. This story still haunts me. I'll never go into the forest again, and every night I hear that child's cry, reminding me that the nightmare will never leave me in peace. My girlfriend Sarah and I decided to spend our vacation in a secluded beach house where we could enjoy the peace and beauty of the ocean. We found a lovely house on the coast in a small town in Maine, USA. It was the perfect place for a getaway, cozy, spacious, with large windows overlooking the ocean and a private beach. The first few days were magical. We spent our time on the beach, swimming, cooking together and admiring the sunsets. But after a few days, strange things started to happen. At first, it was minor changes. Our belongings were moved around as if someone had been moving them while we were out. Initially, we didn't pay much attention to it, attributing it to fatigue or our own forgetfulness. One day, as we returned from a walk, I noticed something in the house's window. I couldn't quite make it out, but it seemed like someone was standing inside watching us. I tried not to panic and decided not to mention it to Sarah, so as not to frighten her. Later that night, while we were having dinner on the terrace, the lights suddenly went out. Everything plunged into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check the circuit breaker, thinking it was just a power outage. But as I was heading back to the house, I heard someone walking inside. My heart started to race, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickly returned to Sarah, who was already on the verge of panic. We barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, hoping the stranger wouldn't be able to reach us. At that moment, we heard a loud knock on the door and a rough voice yelling that he was the owner of the house and demanding that we come out. Trembling with fear, Sarah took her phone and called the police. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for their arrival. The stranger kept banging on the door and shouting, threatening us. I held a flashlight and a chair, ready to defend ourselves. Finally, we heard the sirens of the police cars. The stranger fled, and we were left waiting for help. The police arrived and searched the house, but the intruder was already gone. They reassured us and promised to do everything possible to find him. The next morning, we met with the real estate agent who had rented us the house. He was surprised and bewildered by what had happened. It turned out that the true owner of the house had been out of town for several weeks, and the man who claimed to be him had no right to be there. This news added even more mystery and fear to the story. Who was that man? How did he know about us? And why was he after us? We got no answers to these questions, and that was the most disturbing part. The vacation that was supposed to be peaceful and enjoyable had turned into a nightmare. We decided to leave the house and return home as soon as possible. On the way back, we constantly looked around, afraid that the stranger might be following us. This incident left a deep mark on our memories. We realized that even in the calmest and most picturesque places, danger could lurk. After this event, we became more cautious and suspicious of strangers. Upon returning home, we tried to forget what had happened, but it was difficult. Every strange sound or inexplicable movement in our house triggered panic. We even considered moving to a new place, but ultimately decided to stay and try to overcome our fears. Over time, we began to return to normal life, but that terrifying incident will always remain in our memories. It became a reminder that sometimes even the most innocent decisions can lead to unexpected and frightening consequences.